And welcome to a very special edition of Nostalgia Alley. We are here to celebrate the life of Joe Franklin, who unfortunately passed away on January 24th at the age of 88. Joe Franklin was a good friend, mentor, and if it weren't for Joe Franklin, I would not be sitting in this seat. When cable TV came out in the early days, I'm talking 1975, I wanted to do a show on nostalgia, my number one love. And I went to Joe Franklin because he was doing the same thing that I wanted to do. And usually when you meet a celebrity, you have to go through 3 or 4 agents, you have to go through a secretary. It's a pretty complicated thing. But with Joe, it was a lot different. I went to the office, I opened up the door, and there, sitting in front of a whole lot of old glossies and memorabilia, was Joe Franklin, the man. And I told Joe what I wanted to do, that I wanted to start a show, and he couldn't have been nicer in getting me started. He actually interviewed over 300,000 people. Including Marilyn Monroe, Liza Minnelli, Madonna. He interviewed everybody. And in fact, Bette Midler got her start on the Joe Franklin show because she was very much of an unknown. And I remember Joe Franklin used to actually give her car fare to get on the show. And I remember her sitting there and saying, one day I'm going to become a superstar. And actually, she did, thanks to Joe Franklin. Also, Bruce Springsteen, Woody Allen, Dustin Hoffman, Al Pacino, all got their start on the Joe Franklin show. He was really, if you look up nostalgia in the dictionary, really the true meaning of nostalgia should be Joe Franklin. He was an inspiration to so many people in show business and showed so many people a start in show business. He had the largest collection of sheet music in the world, over 12,500 pieces of sheet music, and also a collection of 10,000 silent movies. He had warehouses. You would actually go up to the warehouse. It was about the size of a football field, filled with sheet music and movies and articles and stills. His office was incredible. You go up to his office, and he had a desk full of stuff. He had stills piled up to the ceiling. And you'd say, Joe, I'd like to get a photo of Rudolph Valentino. Within a millisecond, he would reach into the pile and, like a computer, come out with a picture of Valentino. How he did it, I have absolutely no idea. He never, ever, ever used cue cards. He did everything from the top of his head. He was absolutely amazing, and they asked him about that, and he said he did not like to rehearse. He didn't use teleprompters, and he said, I quote, I was the only guy who never had a production meeting. He said, you don't rehearse your dinner conversation. I'm not saying I was right, but it lasted 43 years. Actually, combined with his TV show, he did over 60 years of broadcasting. He was really incredible. He owned Jack Benny's violin, among memorabilia, Arthur Godfrey's ukulele. He was really amazing. He's going to be missed. He never, ever, ever missed a show in all the 60 years he was doing it. Never missed a show. The only time he missed a TV show was about a week before he passed away with cancer. He was an incredible man, an inspiration, and is really going to be missed. I wanted to do an interview with Joe Franklin. Unfortunately, I never got a chance to do it because of his passing. But I went through the Nostalgia Alley archives, and I was delighted to find out I had done an interview with Joe Franklin back in 1975, which is a mere 40 years ago. And I like to present that to you. This is Joe Franklin that we did over 40 years ago. So what we're going to do is have a public service announcement, and then we are going back into time. Joe Franklin, 40 years ago, 1975. So stay tuned for the public service announcement, and then we're going to see Joe Franklin.
After 17 years working as a mason, Mike was laid off. I met him when he came into the library looking for help. He found a job opening, but the application was only online. Mike said he'd spent his entire life around tools, but had never used a computer. I showed him how, and he ended up applying for numerous jobs online. I saw Mike the other day. His new computer skills paid off. He's working again.
New Jersey libraries are transforming lives. Tell us your story.
Your old friend singing and saying. So let's just settle back and reminisce a bit. What do you say, huh?
Very special edition here on Nostalgia Alley. I'm going to introduce a man that I have been wanting to have on my show for months and months and months. Truly the king of nostalgia, the gentleman who started it all, who literally invented nostalgia. And I am very proud to introduce Mr. Joe Franklin on Nostalgia Alley. Joe, welcome.
Michael, it's a real pleasure to be with you here tonight, and it's so gratifying to know that people are now doing programs built around that word, nostalgia, Nostalgia Alley. And I've heard so much about your show and read so many nice articles about it. And it reminds me, when I started using the word nostalgia in TV 21 years ago, nobody knew that word. This is when it was as yet unfashionable to use that word, nostalgia. And people would write me a letter and say, there's no such word as nostalgia. And then they'd tell me, if I'd look it up in the dictionary, it didn't mean anything to do with old records or old movies. It meant homesick. If you look in the dictionary, nostalgia does.
I did. I looked in the dictionary.
But through the years and through the great amount of usage, it has come to mean the good old days of show business, or collecting antique cars, or collecting any kind of memorabilia or sentimentalia. And I do happily acknowledge that I was the first one to use the word nostalgia. And seriously now, I'm planning to phase out of this whole thing within a year, within 2 years.
Really?
And go more behind the scenes. But I couldn't think of somebody.
Joe, we need you. We need you. You can't do it.
I think I've spoken. I've interviewed 75,000 people. Who's left? Not many left. So another year or two, then we'll turn it over to Mike Sobel.
Joe, how did you get interested in nostalgia? Was it as a child that you developed the interest in old things?
It happened that in the course in the early 1940s, Mike, of going around to the record stores to buy the latest records, they cost in those days 3 for $1. But I found out that I could buy the old ones for $0.01 a piece. So I figured I'd be a little bit frugal, and I bought records by Al Jolson, Eddie Cantor, Sophie Tucker, Joe Penner. You ever hear the name Joe Penner? Mm-hmm. For $0.01 a piece. And then when I was 17 years old, I went into WNEW. I wanted to meet Martin Block. I always wanted to meet. Remember the name Martin Block?
Make-Believe Ballroom.
That's the fella. And he liked me, and he gave me a job choosing his music, and he helped me to get my own program every night. He said, Joe, why don't you play some of those old records that you're always talking about? And so for every night for a quarter hour, I did a program called Vaudeville Isn't Dead. I was 17 and a half years old. I figured I'd stay there for 3 months, 4 months, go back to college and graduate, but I got so involved with being on the air. And then they asked me, could I occupy an hour a day in TV? In other words, I never applied for a job. They just asked me, this is when TV in the daytime was just lighting up, and I figured I'll do the transition. I'll go from old records on radio to old movies on TV. And that's how the whole thing just blossomed. I never looked for it. I never sought it. But it was just handed to me, as they say, on a platter. And I've been there for 20
I
years.
might add that Joe has the longest running show on television, some 20 years on television.
At least, maybe 21, maybe 22. And I see you'll be talking later on about the early days of TV. I think, Michael, I wouldn't swear to it, I don't think it's been notarized, but I think I possibly invented the kind of a show we're doing now, sort of nose to nose, eyeball to eyeball.
Definitely.
The interview show. Because in those days, everything was seltzer bottles and slapstick and Jerry Lester and Broadway Open House and people slipping up and down. In other words, it had to be visual. The word was television. So they said everything on television must be visual.
The pie in the face.
Fine, whoever thought of two people sitting? But I did it one day with Fannie Hurst. I think she was my first guest. Then I did it with Eddie Cantor, and I just sat and spoke. And people said, Joe, you can't just sit on TV and talk. They say if people want to hear talk, they're going to listen to the radio, but they're not going to watch two faces on TV in intimate detail. But I think the talk show has arrived.
Now, very few people realize this, but you're responsible for discovering a lot of the very top people. Who are some of the people you discovered on your show?
Well, that's a nice compliment, Mike. Nobody really discovers, but I did give the first exposure ever on any TV show to Barbara Streisand, Flip Wilson, Bette Midler, Bill Cosby, John Olken. I gave the first TV exposure ever to Joan Rivers and to Al Pacino, Dustin Hoffman, Lainie Kazan, Tiny Tim. I was invited to Tiny Tim's wedding. Remember when he was married on the
Johnny Carson
But
show.
I couldn't make the wedding, Mike. I couldn't find a formal shopping bag. But I was invited to the wedding, and I think I've probably given the big debut to more than Ed Sullivan, because they deal with established stars. So I sort of try and choose the ones that will make it.
I remember the title of your show originally was Memory Lane, which is a beautiful title. How did you come to name the show Memory Lane?
That's a very interesting point. My first guest, I couldn't get any guests. Nowadays, the same as you're offered 1,000 a week, I'm offered maybe 1,000 a day. In those days, I couldn't get any guests. My first show, I called up everybody. Broadway stars, movie stars, recording stars, unknown stars. Nobody would come out with me because they didn't know me. But I called up Fannie Hurst. Now, Fannie Hurst was the author of Backstreet, Imitation of Life, Humoresque, great lady author. And she said, Mr. Franklin, if you want me, I'll do it. She liked my voice on the phone. She came onto my show. After the program, Michael, I went to her apartment. She lived at the Hotel des Artistes, across the street from Channel 7, and I looked at her library of books. And there were all of her books lined up, and I pulled out one called Great Laughter. That title appealed to me, Great Laughter. And I opened up to the table of contents, and the chapter 1 was called A Whole Bunch of Memory Lanes. And I just took an immediate loving to that phrase. I said, Miss Hurst, could I call my show Memory Lane? She said, Joe, I don't own that title. She said, that's a public domain expression to begin with. So I called my show Memory Lane in honor of that chance glance at Fannie Hurst's book called Great Laughter.
Talking about people who appeared on your show, I know you were very close with Eddie Cantor. Tell us a little bit about what the man was like.
Eddie was sort of my inspiration for wanting to be in this business, Mike. There was something about him that was electric. If he'd walk into a room, the room would light up. And he met me, he liked me. I wrote his radio show when I was a kid. Not the comedy show, but a show that he did in his twilight years called Ask Eddie Cantor. It was a program where he would play 4 old phonograph records a week from my library, and I'd write the dialogue for him. And he was on my show about 6 times. The first time that he was on, we did 90 minutes in depth, just looking at each other. I left out all my commercials that day, left out 18 commercials. Nobody objected, no sponsors seemed to be upset about that. And I think that was the beginning of the interview in depth. Nowadays you get somebody doing 90 minutes with one person as distinguished from 8 minutes, boom, 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 rat-tat-tat-tat. And that was the beginning of the single interview. And Eddie Cantor, to me, was the master showman, master entertainer, and sadly not forgotten, but neglected today in many compilations of show business. And I presented him at Carnegie Hall in a one-man show. We got very close. He died in 1964. He used to sort of envy Jack Benny, because he told me that Jack Benny was so low-key, soft sell, and Eddie was so frantic and feverish, and he got his heart attack. And one time Jack Benny told me that he wished he could be like Eddie Cantor, so full of pep and frantic and feverish. So you can't ever be pleased. But Cantor did work hard on the stage, and he did get his heart attack one night after a Colgate comedy hour from, in those days, everything was live. You had to do a whole hour fast, and I miss him. I think that...
A great man, truly.
I think there'll be a renaissance of interest soon in Eddie Cantor. I get that feeling. I do.
I think, Joe, that the highest honor that anybody can receive is having a show on the air for 20 years. It's a remarkable accomplishment in today's TV industry, because usually it's 13 weeks and the show is over. How do you account for your success of 20 years of broadcasting, which amounts to how many shows, roughly?
I would say untold thousands of shows. I think the answer is every radio personality has tried a TV talk show. They just couldn't make it. They tried. There's something that I see in your face, Michael. It's a thing known as maybe a wide-eyed honesty or an innocence or something. You can't fool the camera. If you're a little bit mean, a little bit angry, a little bit hostile, or if you're not sincere, the camera catches it. And I don't think I'm a wise guy. I'm not a smart type. I think the audience watches me because I try to ask my guest what they would like to know. I don't try to be bold or shocking or wise guy. Now, I can make the same points as the wise guy interviewers. I could tell you 10 who 3 years ago were very big in New York City. There's not one working now anymore because they were offensive. Now, I can make the same points as the so-called nasty or offensive interviewers, but I can do it in a very charming, nice, quiet, innocent, subtle way. There is out there a cult, especially the people who watch me late at night on the weekends, as distinguished from the early morning shift. But there's a cult that can sort of read between the lines when I've made a strong point or even a semi-nasty point with a guest, but they'll scratch their heads and they'll say, Joe Franklin really couldn't have said that. He's too nice. They're very perceiving, but then they'll scratch their heads again the second time, and they'll say, he did say that. He did ask that man kind of a bold or a daring question, but I do it in a tender way, an affectionate way, that nobody gets too offended. I've had a few get up and walk away.
I was going to ask you, could you name some people who
didn't like me?
Just got up and walked away?
Rosemary Clooney, the late Robert Strauss, John Gavin, the actor, a few like that. But I would say, on the whole, that I get along with most guests because I try, as I said, to put myself in the position of the viewer. I don't take phone calls from viewers on the air. I was doing that 15 years ago. Now I got bored with it. I was the first one ever, when everything in TV had to be kind of vanilla. I was the first one to talk about air pollution, try and save the ecology. I was the first one. If I would get a letter from a lady maybe 18, 19 years ago, she would say, Dear Joe, my husband just got out of jail, he can't find a job. I was the first one to try and dramatize on TV the need for prison reform. I was the first one, I think, to cover serious issues on a so-called talk show. Lately, I've drifted off the serious plane because I think you've got enough news. I think a TV talk show now should be more in the area of entertainment.
In all the years you've been on, have you had some embarrassing moments that where everything seemed to go wrong and you were sort of left holding the bag, so to speak?
Well, in 1955, my guest was Ernest Borgnine, who had just won the Academy Award for Marty. But I hadn't seen the movie, and I didn't know how to pronounce his name. So I said, here is a brand new household tradition, America's great new star. I said, Ernest Borgnine. That's the way it's spelled. And he shook my hand very, very heavy, hard. He said, Joe, it's a pleasure to say goodbye to you. And he walked off the set. But I had one man died on my show. Actually,
on your show?
Dropped dead of a heart attack. And that made the front pages. And his wife apologized to me. He was he had a heart condition. And she told me that he was warned by his doctor not to go on any TV shows or get excited. A well-known actor, it's not important who. And I would say the embarrassing moments usually come when you get a guest who's on to plug a book and his mind is on that one track to plug the book and plug and plug and plug. And every question, every answer goes back to a plug for that book. So now and then I'll say to him, let's save the plug for last. And I'm embarrassed, but I've got to do it on camera. I've got no other choice. I think the ones who sell the most books are the soft sellers.
I know you have personally a vast collection of records and movies. How many records and movies do you have in your private collection?
I would say about 75,000 old 78s, the whole golden age of show business. And I've got maybe 10,000 or 12,000 old movies. There was one movie that I wanted. I ran across it last week. I've been searching for this movie, Michael, for 12 years. I was intrigued by the title. It's a silent movie called What Every Woman Wants. And
I wouldn't touch that line with a 10-foot
No,
pole.
I was curious. Finally, somebody helped me track down the movie. I ran home to my projector. I threaded up the projector so eagerly. What do you think it was that every woman wanted? It was the right to vote. It was a 1918 suffragette movie. There were still maybe 10 or 12 films I'm searching for, but it's a race against time to get these films. Because in the old days, you know, they were made on nitrate film. They've all crumbled. They've sort of deteriorated into nothingness, into dust. They decompose. Now we have safety film, but in those days we had this nitrate inflammable film, and it's getting tougher all the time to find these old movies.
Do you have a favorite movie that
of all
you hold
time?
near and dear?
That's a good question. I would say probably Gone with the Wind or The Birth of a Nation, or a couple of pictures. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde with Frederick March. Just died a couple weeks ago, Frederick March. I would say probably A Streetcar Named Desire with Vivian Leigh. Maybe about six like that.
It's incredible. Tell us a little bit about the Joe Franklin off television. I know a lot of people are very curious to know about you, Joe. And
Well, I get home at night and I say to my wife, and now a word from the sponsor. But no, I'm the same. I'm the same. It's hard to turn off. When you're in my field, Mike, you're always thinking, no matter who you talk to, no matter what you see or do, you relate it in your mind to your program. How you can sort of interpolate it, how you can make use of whatever knowledge you've picked up. And it's a question of, I don't go after my guests. They come to me. I just never learned how to ask. And when you realize that other programs have staffs that beg and seek and solicit, and through the years, the ones that have come to me have included Shirley Temple, Leopold Stokowski, Eddie Cantor, Joe Louis, Muhammad Ali, Barbara Streisand. The list is endless. It's just Cary Grant, who never goes on TV shows, the late Robert Taylor,
Incredible.
Tony Curtis, Robert Mitchum, Jane Fonda, and so forth. It's when it's all over, I'm going to scratch my head and I'm going to say, I wonder how it all happened that I got so lucky.
You know, Joe is truly, Joe helped me get started in the business, which I'm very grateful for. And Joe is a very warm individual. If you have a problem or you want to talk with Joe, he's a person you can go to and talk with on an eyeball level. And especially in today's industry, where you have to go through about 8 or 9 executive secretaries and then wait around for about 3.5 years. And if you're lucky, you get an appointment to see that person.
Right.
Joe is a very warm person and has helped an awful lot of people in show business.
Well, the big thing is nostalgia. Now, if somebody today, let's say they represent Hedy Lamarr, or let's say they represent Myrna Loy or Sylvia Sidney, if they would call up the average talk show to get those people on that show, you know what the talent coordinator would say? They would say, who are those people? We don't want those people. And you and I have a great affection for those people. And if I weren't that approachable, I wouldn't have ever interviewed Jimmy Durante or Kate Smith or Jack Benny, because these are people that were submitted to me by friends of theirs who'd call me up. They would say, Joe, I watch you every day. Jimmy Durante's coming to my house tomorrow night for lasagna. How would you like it if I could convince Jimmy, if I could persuade Jimmy to come onto your show? They say they like my style. I say, are you kidding? If you can get Jimmy on my show, I'd love you. But if I weren't there to answer that phone call, if I sort of routed that to a talent staff or a coordinator, I never would have made that affiliation with the man who in turn got me with Jimmy Durante. So by being that accessible, it has paid off for me.
I can always recognize you because you have a telephone in each ear.
Right. And at night
Constantly.
At night I've got to have that phone surgically removed because it gets stuck inside the ear.
You know who we're going to meet right now, and I'd like you to be my co-host. Be very honored if you'd stick by. We're going to be talking about the fabulous days of television in the 1950s when they had Jackie Gleason and your show of shows with Sid Caesar. And we're going to go in depth about how television was approached in the 50s and what it's like now. And before we introduce the two gentlemen from TV Show People magazine, I'd like everybody to read my box office number if you'd like to get in contact with me personally and be involved in Nostalgia Alley. And we'll be right on the track after about a minute and a half, so stand by.
Oh my God, I'm 40 years older. I can't believe it. Where does this time go? Anyway, that was Joe Franklin. Delightful interview. Was really one of my very first shows on television, and he will be missed. In fact, my dad, who wrote a book called The Hospital Makers, which came out with Doubleday, I got him on a Joe Franklin show, and we did not only the radio show, which is 45 minutes, but also the TV show. It's a shame we lost him because he was the #1 authority on nostalgia. The amazing thing with Joe, you could ask him any question in the world, and his mind was like a computer. You could ask him Rudolph Valentino's birthday. He had stories and so many great things to tell. And unfortunately, we're not going to have Joe around anymore, but we do have the memories and the good times that so many people had. He was on early in the morning, and he was on very late at night. He's survived by his son and his wife. They got divorced, but she moved out to Florida, and Joe said that she moved to the only place that did not carry the Joe Franklin show. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed everything. It's a pleasure to be able to salute Joe Franklin. And as I say, he'll be very much missed. So I'd like to say good night to you, and especially to you, Joe Franklin.